A very good evening and welcome to Vantage Point with me, Zulfiq Farzan. And the question in everyone's mind right now, can the Prime Minister command confidence in Parliament? Joining me as usual this evening is Dr. Dayan Tilaka. Doctor, let me start off by asking you the same question I posed right now.
Okay.
Can the Prime Minister command confidence in Parliament?
Well, if you're talking about the parliamentary arithmetic, the answer is I don't know. But if you're talking about the political dimension, can he command confidence politically in the government, in his own government, and in the parliament in general? I would say absolutely not. I mean, every day on the news, you either have members of his own party who say, look, we have to make a major change. Some say the leadership must change. Some are talking about a move of rebellion against the leader. Some are not. But there is, the opening line is something major has to change, which means they don't have any confidence in their present leadership to do the right thing. And they say, look, this has to be done urgently. You even hear UNPers saying on television, and serious ones, credentialed ones, that, well, we can't win an election under this leadership. So, manifestly, the UNP has a spider web of cracks. The UNP is fissured. Whether or not they will vote for the PM at the no confidence motion, if there is a no confidence motion, I do not know. But what I do see on primetime television is a lack of confidence in the leadership within the UNP. Now, there's a reason for that. That is because this leader has had a very bad electoral track record. And right now, while being in government, he's taken his party down to 32%, which isn't much. They've lost 1.5 million votes between 2015 August and now. So there is a crisis of confidence in the leader of the party within the party itself. Now, what about his coalition partners? Nobody can hide the fact, I mean, it's been written about, talked about, telecast, that the president of the country suggested that he move out.
Indeed.
And he said no. And the president said, find me somebody in the UNP as an alternative. You can stay in government, but I need another prime minister. So obviously the president doesn't have confidence in him.
And what's most surprising, Doctor, is this talk about a no confidence motion started off with one of the UNP members themselves.
Yes.
Who said there are a group of UNPers who are preparing a no confidence motion against their own leadership, their own prime minister. And then several days later, you saw members of the joint opposition and several other parties piggybacking on this motion. Now, when the no confidence motion is presented, Doctor, now, the Prime Minister, as we know, has ways of tackling things. If you might recall, several years ago, the incident at Sirikota.
Yes.
When there was a revolt against him within the party.
Isn't that the occasion where he complained to the CID about Sirasa? And I think some of your executives were hauled up for the, before the...
But I can say, Doctor, that was the day that he gave us
the
rock.
The rock,
sir.
yes, that's right.
Rock. The infamous rock.
The infamous rock.
At a press conference where he gave one of our reporters.
That's right.
So the Prime Minister has a way of swiggling away from things that come against him.
Yeah.
At this point, when the no confidence motion is going to be tabled against him, what can we expect the Prime Minister to do?
Well, in the first place, it wasn't Palitha Rangabandara who first suggested the idea of a no confidence motion. It was Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because in the power struggle between the President and the PM, where the President wanted the PM to step down, and the president was having negotiations with members of the the United National Party. The Prime Minister's comeback was, no, you can't do that according to the 19th Amendment. If you want to get rid of me, there's only one way to go.
The motion of no
A
confidence.
motion of no confidence. That was the PM's comeback. That was the card the Prime Minister played. So now, it seems to have, got out of control, because everybody's talking about a no confidence motion. Now, I don't know at this moment as we speak whether it will be tabled or not, but it's out there. It's out there. So that cannot but damage the Prime Minister, and to the extent that he's clinging on to office, it can't but damage the credibility of the government as a whole. Now, the SLFP, hardly a day passes without the SLFP manifesting some kind of dissent against the Prime Minister. Some of it is on TV talk shows. Some of it is as they come out of any public place and the TV cameras are there and microphones are shoved in their face. So, there is discontent about the Prime Minister within his party. There is discontent within the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, which is his partner in the coalition, and there was obvious dissatisfaction on the part of the executive president. Now, so he might be able to retain the numbers in Parliament thanks also to the TNA, but the confidence, I mean, does he enjoy the confidence of the major players? Obviously not. This is a man whose base is shrinking. His electoral base has shrunk. He's taken the party down with him to 32%. And his own base in the party is shrinking. Nobody believes that the UNP can win an election so long as he's at the helm. They know that he can't be the candidate, I mean, at the next presidential election, if they are to stand a chance of a snowball in hell. So, there is no confidence in the Prime Minister, but he stays there.
With that, we go into a short commercial break, and from what the doctor says, so we'll have to see what will happen to the Prime Minister if a motion of no confidence is tabled in Parliament against him. Join us after this short commercial. As the power struggle continues in Sri Lankan politics, and as a motion of no confidence is being prepared against the Prime Minister, one of the promises made by the government when they were elected has been, some say, established or met with the appointment of the Office on Missing Persons. Doctor, we've been waiting for a long time for this. Now, some say with the appointment of the Office on Missing Persons, there'll be closure for families who've been waiting to know what happened to their loved ones. Either they are living or they're no more. But why so long, Doctor, for an Office on Missing Persons? It's been 3 years since the government was elected. If this office comes into effect, now it's established, but what can we expect from it? Is it going to be another commission where the facts are being reported and then someone scrutinizes it once again?
Well, I don't think it's going to work. First, let me address why it took so long, and then let me tell you why I think it's not going to work. Now, an Office of Missing Persons is a good thing in most cases. There are countries which do not go that route. I would say many countries don't go that route. But it's not unhealthy. But when an Office of Missing Persons is established, it's usually by consensus. That is, a country has been through a military dictatorship, there have been disappearances, or there has been a terrible civil war, and the two sides have negotiated a settlement. And then they decide that you need some closure, so you've got to look at what happened. And the two sides agree. Society agrees that you have to look at this. And then you appoint an Office of Missing Persons with people who are respected across the board. not controversial people, but people who have stature and standing. Now, none of that happened here. It didn't happen here because you did not have a military dictatorship earlier and a democratic civilian government taking over, which wants to look back at what happened. What you had was a legitimate government or succession of governments, one of which finally succeeded in putting down a separatist, terrorist insurgency of a major scale and long duration. Now, you did not have a negotiated settlement. If you did have a negotiated settlement, then an office of the missing persons is one of the things that usually put in place by mutual agreement. What you have here is an OMP that is set up as a result of a very controversial resolution in Geneva in 2015. So it comes from outside. It's from top down. It is not something that has an underlying consensus supporting it.
Does it mean that we are doing something in fear of the Human Rights Commission?
We are doing something, you know, no, it's not really fear, because that resolution was passed in the funniest way. The Prime Minister, Mr. Wickremesinghe, disclosed at an after-dinner speech that Sri Lanka was beginning to negotiate the resolution, and that he was informed by the British High Commissioner, who's presently serving here, James Doris, that the Sri Lankan delegation was trying to tamper with the Western resolution. And Mr. Wickremesinghe said that he telephoned the Sri Lankan team and said, you don't bother with the content of this resolution. We will decide these matters in Colombo. You just go ahead and sign it. So you had a resolution that was not negotiated by the Sri Lankan side and does not enjoy the support even of the cabinet. I mean, the president himself has hesitated, though he did sign the OMP, the setting up of the OMP. He has expressed his dissent over some aspects of the resolution.
So, Doctor, we went in blind when this resolution was passed.
No, we didn't go in blind. Prime Minister Wickremesinghe and Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraweera bypassed their own parliament and cabinet and deliberately signed up to a resolution.
More of an authoritarian way of doing it.
An authoritarian, and it was like the central bank bond scam. It lacked transparency. It was more than a bit dodgy. This is the diplomatic equivalent of the central bank bond scam. Just as somebody took the decision to shift the method of auctions and took the central bank under his wing and brought in a non-Sri Lankan citizen from Singapore.
Whereas in previous instances, the finance minister was in charge of the central bank.
Exactly. The same thing happened concerning the Geneva resolution. So now you have an OMP that comes from a process which is different from the way most countries set up OMPs when they do decide to set such organizations up. Now, the second thing is the composition of the OMP. As I said, usually you have people who are so respectable, of such stature, that nobody questions it. But now you have even a very moderate and senior minister of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, Mr. John Seneviratne, questioning the composition of the OMP. He says, you know, I can't agree with this composition. Why? Because many of the OMP members are active partisan leaders of NGOs which have campaigned against Sri Lanka in Geneva. I can say that when I was serving as ambassador in Geneva, Mrs. Nimalka Fernando, who for some reason is now called Dr. Nimalka Fernando, was one of the most stridently vociferous spokespersons of NGOs who should turn up at the Human Rights Council, including in 2009 when we had just won the war, and accused us of war crimes. Now, when you have such partisan people who have been leaders of NGOs which are foreign funded, who come entirely from that sector, as members of the OMP, then it becomes a polarizing issue. So I think there's going to be resistance or non-compliance, and I don't think this is going to work well.
Will the Office on Missing Persons work? Now, some great thoughts and insight from Dr. Dan Jatilaka on the establishment of this office. So we'll have to see how the commissioners of this OMP will be working on to bring what they call closure to the victims and the families who were devastated by the 3-decade-long conflict. And with that, we go in for a short commercial. On a global scale, the Italian elections took place, and one of the former prime ministers of Italy suffered a huge setback when the results came out, and now he has stepped down from party politics. Doctor, this is just one example. We've seen over the years many leaders from political parties, they suffer defeat, they openly say, okay, I'm stepping down, it's time for someone else to take over.
Not here.
And then, Doctor, last week or a week before, the Singaporean Prime Minister made a remarkable speech in the Singapore Parliament before they debated the budget, that he is passing a resolution to give way for young parliamentarians, young faces, new faces, to come up and take positions in the cabinet and in Parliament. But, Doctor, we don't see that taking place here in Sri Lanka. Now, with that, Doctor, the UNP leadership has suffered a massive defeat at the local government elections. There were calls for him to resign. Those fell on deaf ears, and now there's a motion of no confidence that is being prepared against him. He seems to be facing that in a rather bravado manner. But, Doctor, shouldn't examples around the world be taken into consideration when you're governing a country like this?
Well, most certainly, and you know, one of the things that the opposition pointed out, Dala Salha Peruma, made some fairly clever observations the other day. He pointed out that Mr. Wickremesinghe became the leader of the UNP in 1994. And he says, since 1994, the United States has had Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, and now Trump as presidents. Britain has had Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, and now Theresa May. The Catholic Church has had Pope John Paul II,
Pope
Benedict, and now Pope Francis. The Sri Lankan Adivasi community has gone from Tisahami to Vanilatho. The Sri Lankan presidency has seen a change from D.B. Wijatunga, Chandrika Kumaratunga, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and now Maithripala Sirisena. But Mr. Wickremesinghe stays just where he is. Now, it's a huge anachronism, not only in Sri Lanka, but globally, in terms of leadership of any institution. And it's not as if he has been a conspicuously successful leader either in electoral terms. His party is now down to 32% while it's been in office. So, well, I don't think he's going to look at Matteo Renzi and resign, because he never does it. He's just going to stay on and sink his party further into the mire. That's what Mr. Wickremesinghe is going to do. But Italy, I mean, since you did mention Renzi, the result of Sunday's election is very, very interesting, because it helps us understand what is happening in Sri Lanka with the local authorities election and very probably the forthcoming elections to the provincial councils and then presidential election next year and the parliamentary one after that. And what's happening globally. What happened in Italy is that though they are finding it difficult to form a government, more than 50% of the vote was obtained by 3 populist nationalist parties led by relatively younger people. The 3 parties are sort of improbably named. The 5-Star Movement is one.
Okay.
The Northern League, which is an older populist party, is the other. And the last one is called the Brothers of Italy. Now, these are all populists. The Economist London talks about the populist surge in Italy. Everybody's talking about this rise of populism. Some say the rise of populist nationalism, because these parties do have a kind of a nationalist fervor and flavor. Now, that's a global thing. That's happening all over the world. What the UNP is trying to defend here, which is neoliberal globalism or neoliberal cosmopolitanism, the old elite establishment. Well, not the old elite, because the old elite like Vasanta Senanayake and so on are opposed to Mr. Wickremesinghe. But this whole neoliberal globalism, this establishment which engages in those economic policies all over the world, it's crumbling, it's on the retreat, it's being defeated. And the UNP is trying to hold on to policies and personalities and a profile which is being swept away throughout the world, including in the West. I mean, that's what Brexit was about.
Indeed. Doctor, speaking of political profiles, one important point that I want to mention is the Ministry of Law and Order. Now, it's under the Prime Minister. And we've seen the incident, if you recall, about the farmers. There are many comments coming out now saying that could have been resolved if the law was enforced accordingly. And they're practically blaming the Prime Minister's authority for the failure in resolving such an issue. So at this point, there is also talk about again proposing Field Marshal Sarath Fonseca to that post. Now, what can we expect? Is the Prime Minister going to willingly give it?
Well, it's the Prime Minister who has written 5 times to President Sirisena suggesting that Field Marshal Fonseca be given this post. So I think the Prime Minister has no problem with it. But I see this as a somewhat disturbing trend, because the UNP is seeking to turn to an authoritarian right-wing figure in order to manage its own crisis, to put down its own dissenters, to try to scare the SLFP, to intimidate the president, and to crack down hard on demonstrations. Now, I'm all for cracking down hard on racist manifestations. But if Field Marshal Fonseca had been Minister of Law and Order and had tried to confront the peasant citizens of Tambutegama, you would have had a peasant uprising all over the island. So a hard line or mailed fist at a time when you're in economic crisis and there are manifestations of popular protest and the government's popularity is on the decline as manifested in the last election. Now, that's a recipe for disaster. That's a way of ensuring that there's a proliferation of confrontations. You can't put down the students and the peasants and protesters and the JO and so on, and lock up the leaders on corruption charges, use the mailed fist against street demonstrations. I mean, the whole thing will just capsize. So I think it will be a very poor choice at this point of time.
And finally, Doctor, before we wrap up today's program, one question that I want to pose yet again is about this motion of no confidence, that the Prime Minister is going to face a serious battle because his own people are working against him. Like I mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister has a way of rattling his way out of incidents like this, if you remember Sirikota as well. Now, when this motion of no confidence, let's say it is passed and the Prime Minister has to leave, and that means the government is in imbalance, would that prompt authorities or the legislative figure to call for an immediate parliamentary election?
Probably not. It doesn't have to be the case, because the Constitution very clearly makes provision for the President to regard the government as standing dissolved, the cabinet, and in 24 hours he can appoint the cabinet of his choice, including the same UNP, minus
the Prime Minister,
Mr. Wickremesinghe as Prime Minister. I mean, he can appoint another UNP as Prime Minister or member of the SLFP as PM. So there won't be any crisis. It'll only be a crisis for the for the PM.
And a question of faith among the people.
Yes. Now, it's a catch-22. He has to decide, the PM has to decide whether he places himself above his own party. Because the only way his party can recover is by having a leader about whom they don't say, look, so long as he's the leader, we are not going to win another election. I mean, imagine the UNP having to face the next election, UNP organizers, UNP MPs, with Mr. Vikram Singh as leader, battered by the bond scam, battered by this inner party struggle, battered by the governmental, the intra-governmental resentment at him. How can they even get the voters out to go and vote? He's dropped the UNP before, now he's down to 32. He's dropped the UNP to 29% at one time on his watch. So he'll drop it down into the 20s.
And then into the 10s.
Well,
if we go for another one.
It could happen. I mean, look what has happened in Italy to the establishment parties of centre-right and centre-left, to the establishment. Look what happened to the establishment parties in France. They were lucky to have Macron breaking away and forming en masse and triumphing in 1 year, but against the old centre-right establishment and the centre-left establishment. So everywhere in the world, these elitist establishments, whether they are centre-right or centre-left, and this Yahapalana government is a combination of the centre-right and the centre-left, are being swept away by one or the other form of populism, with or without nationalism. In Sri Lanka, you have a nationalist populist opposition, which is on the rise. And, you don't have to be a wizard to know which way the electoral wind is blowing.
There are many questions that Sri Lankans are facing right now when it comes to politics. Number one, what changes are the UNPers hoping for from within the party? And number two, what's the Prime Minister going to do when he has to battle the motion of no confidence that is going to come against him? Thank you, Dr. Dan Jalkar, once again for joining us on Vantage Point with your great insights on Sri Lankan politics and in global politics as well. And with that, we wrap up this edition of Vantage Point. I'm Zulfiq Farzan. Have a pleasant evening.